We are currently in the Rambam Maimonides, in the middle of chapter 10 of the Laws of Kings. As we've been discussing, that towards the end of the Laws of Kings is where the Noachide, the 7 Noachide commandments fall in. And we learned chapters 8 and 9. Actually, the end of chapter 8, chapter 9 primarily. And now we're in chapter 10 up to law or paragraph number 4. Now, before we see it inside, let me just remind you that as a rule, with some exceptions, biblically speaking, I'm not speaking the way it is practically today. Today it's not done so. However, biblically speaking, which today would be theoretically, if a Noachide, a non-Jew, transgresses any of the 7, so that would be a capital offense, and the means of the way they would be put to death would be what's called sayif, or cherev, and that would be decapitating them. Now, in Jewish law, for the Jewish people, there are 4 types of death penalties, 4 different forms of death that the Jewish courts, depending on the sin, would kill the Jew, the transgressor. And one of them, for certain sins, is that beheading them, is the decapitating. However, there are what's considered more severe. The worst of the 4 is stoning to death. That's considered the most extreme death penalty. Then you have what's called burning, where they would pour down hot lead down the person's throat and they would die that way. And only afterwards, number 3, is the punishment of decapitating. And then number 4 would be strangling to death. So, by Bnei Noach, the Noachites, there isn't that difference. Basically, it's always going to be what would be called the 3rd type of death penalty. So now, having said that, I'm going to read and translate law number 4 in chapter 10. Ben Noach, a Noachide, Shebeirech Hashem, that committed blasphemy. Now, literally, it says that they blessed God. And that's because we don't want to even say explicitly the opposite of that. But it means the opposite. And in Talmudic, in Jewish rabbinic literature, such as here in Maimonides, that's the expression, that's the term, the way they use it. Instead of saying cursing, they don't want to even say such a thing. So we say blessing God, and we know it means the opposite. So a Noachide that transgressed by being blasphemous, or that he or she worshipped idolatry, or number 3, that he, the Noachide, had marital relations with someone else's wife. So that would be adultery. Number 4, alternatively, shaharak chaveroi, that he killed a fellow human being. So he's giving examples of any of these 4, which every one of them is a capital offense. And the penalty for each one of these would be death by way of the sword. Now remember, as we learned previously, not only is the death penalty different, but also how we judge them and how we get to that point. For a Jew, for example, there must be 2 witnesses, and the court must be a minimal of 23 members. For the Noachites, 1 witness would be sufficient, and 1 judge would be sufficient as well. So just remember all those details. And now look what happens. So this Noachite, which transgressed and committed any one of these sins, v'niskayer, and then he or she converted to Judaism. We discussed earlier in the previous law about a Noachite converting. And if they, after they convert to Judaism, they want to turn back, if you remember we spoke about this last time, there's no turning back once they've completed their conversion. So let's say a Noachite transgressed any of these big sins, capital offenses, and then they converted to Judaism, complete conversion, a proper full conversion. Patur, now they are exempt. They're not put to death. And the reason for that, let's take each case. So as far as blasphemy, in order to put him to death, when he was a Noachite, all you needed was 1 witness and 1 judge and no warning. But now the person's Jewish. So they need 2 witnesses, and you have to have at least 23, and the death penalty is a different death penalty. So therefore, it would have been a more severe death penalty as a Jew. It would have been stoning. And originally, as the Noachite, it was a lesser. So it's all different. The process is stricter for the Jew, and the death penalty is a worse, stricter death penalty. So therefore, this person is totally exempt, and they're not put to death at all. Now, one of the other commentaries actually explains the logic behind it. When I get the person, the logic, because our sages teach us that a convert, someone who becomes Jewish, is considered like a newborn, like a child who just was born. So in that case, it's not even the same person. They're a different person. So nothing that they did as a non-Jew, as a Noachite, can be transferred over to this Jewish person now. So much so that there's a question that is dealt with, and that is as follows. What happens in the following case? A non-Jew, a Noachite, has children. Let's say a son and a daughter. They're all not Jewish. The father, the mother, the 2 children. And then the Noachite, the father, converts, becomes Jewish. And so do the children. Did he fulfill his obligation of the commandment of be fruitful and multiply, the first of the 613 commandments? Did this Jew fulfill this mitzvah, the commandment of having children? 2 ways to look at it. 1, of course they did. He has Jewish children. There's biological children, and they're Jewish. So he did a mitzvah. The other way to look at it is, no, he did not. Because when he fathered these children, he was a Noachite. So it's a wonderful thing for Noachites to have children. They're supposed to. He fulfilled his obligation as a Noachite. Now, a Jew doesn't fulfill his obligation of having non-Jewish children. If a Jew, God forbid, was to have children from a non-Jewish woman and the children are not Jewish, he didn't fulfill his obligation. So the Noachide has non-Jewish children. Wonderful. As soon as he converts, he's like a new person. His children are only biologically his. They are not legally, by Jewish law, his anymore, even if they convert. So if they too go through conversion and become Jewish, they're not really considered biblically his children. And biblically, before the rabbis stepped into the picture and sort of modified, if you will, the ruling, and I'll soon explain, biblically speaking, when that convert, the father that is, when he dies, the children don't have to mourn at all, as a child needs to mourn for a parent. When the child, for example, the boy, would be called up to read from the Torah scroll, like we do every Shabbos, every Saturday, etc., and you call up the person traditionally by the name of their father. And if it's a convert, we say the son of Abraham. This child would be called as the son of Abraham, according to most opinions. And furthermore, biblically speaking, the father would be permitted to marry his own daughter, who converted as well, because it's not his daughter legally. As long as he's not married, of course, it's to her mother, whatever. And if they all converted, I don't want to get too complicated, but he can actually marry the daughter while he's still married to her biological mother. Talking about polygamy, biblically speaking, when that's permitted. So let me try to map this out for you. Again, this is not practically speaking. It is forbidden nowadays, but biblically speaking, originally, here's the scenario. You have Mr. A. He is married to Mrs. A. He has a son whose name is B for boy. He's got a daughter whose name is G for girl. They're all Noachites. Mr. and Mrs. A, husband and wife. They had two children, B and G. They all went through conversion. So first of all, if they want to remain married, obviously, they have to now get married Jewishly with a chuppah. That's no question. And that actually happens often when families convert. If a couple converts, of course, they have to remarry. So then, Mr. A and his non-Jew and his wife, who they were both married to each other when they were Jewish, they convert. They go through another wedding. Mr. A and Mr. B get married. Their children now, who've gone through conversion, let's assume that the children are adults to keep it simple. So he's got a 20-year-old son, B, and he's got an 18-year-old daughter, G. Big happy family. Mr. A, Mrs. A, son B, daughter G. Wonderful. They're all family. Because they went through conversion, the children, B and G, are not related to each other, nor to either of their parents. They are not their parents. Their Jewish parents are the same as Mr. A and Mrs. A, Abraham and Sarah. Therefore, B and G can get married to each other. We said that Noachites cannot marry their own siblings. Here, they are 100%. They're not half brother and sister. Biologically, they are 100% siblings from both parents. They can marry each other. Furthermore, the father, Mr. A, could marry his biological daughter, G, even while married to her mother, Mrs. A. Sounds crazy. Okay. Now, because it sounds crazy, and actually, not because it sounds crazy, but because it looks like from becoming a Noachite to becoming a Jew, they went down a level. Because when they were not Jewish, this would be forbidden. This would be a form of adultery for Mr. A to marry his daughter, G. Can't do that. Or for the brother and sister, B and G, for them to get married, be a big sin. So now that they became Jewish, that's okay. That looks like from becoming a Noachide to becoming Jewish is not an ascend going higher. It's not progressing, but it looks like it's going down in holiness and sanctity. That what before was forbidden now is permitted. Therefore, the great sages, the rabbis, which they have a right to do this, instituted a rule, and they said they are forbidding it. So rabbinically speaking, it is forbidden for Mr. A to ever marry his daughter G, even after he divorces or his wife passes away. Irrelevant. This is his biological daughter. When they were Bnei Noach, he couldn't marry her. He can't marry her now as well, ever. And for that matter, brother and sister, B and G, could never get married to each other. So that it shouldn't look like becoming a Jew is going down instead of going up. All right, now, for that, so because of that, if someone committed any of these terrible sins as a Noachide and then converted and became Jewish, they are exempt. They're not put to death. Continues Maimonides and says, Harag ben Yisrael, what about if this Noachide, before they converted, murdered a Jew, or the Noachide had relations with a Jewish married woman, Viniskayer, and then after that crime, after that sin, he converted. Chayav, in that case, he is put to death, even though it changed. In other words, had he been a Noachide, the death penalty would have been by the sword. Now that he's Jewish, it's strangulation. So why do we say that here he is obligated? So that's why it's important to remember the order of the 4 death penalties. The Noachide normally gets number 3. But in this case, the penalty for the Jew who transgresses by killing someone or having relations with a married woman is the 4th one, is chenek, is strangulation. So therefore, to go down a level, that's okay. So the Noachide would be put to death as a Jew. So here it doesn't really work, the logic that we said before, as far as like being a new person and what they did before doesn't count and is irrelevant. No, here we're not saying that. So here we're strictly focusing on the type of death penalty. So if a Noachide would have had to get a certain death penalty, and now because they became Jewish, it's a worse penalty, then they're completely free, no death. But if, as a Noachite, it would have been a certain death penalty, and now because they became Jewish, it's a lesser, then they are put to death. So we do kill the Noachide for killing a Jew. And we do give him strangulation for having relations with a Jewish married woman, because he's now Jewish. So therefore the penalty is a different one. It's not by the sword, like a Bnei Noach, but rather it's strangulation, which is lesser. And the logic here is what is used in Talmudic logic is that included in 200 is 100. So if you're giving the person the lesser, well, that would be included in the more severe one that they had they been a Noachide. Now again, all of this is practically not relevant nowadays, but to put things into perspective and into the picture of how it all works, that's basically the system here. Now, in the next law, he's going to tell us the exception of when a Noachide gets a different death penalty other than decapitating. But normally, as a rule, it is decapitating. Okay, so before we open up for questions, we're going to do number 5 now. Next. Farbe Yarnu, we already explained in the previous chapter, Shekol Misas Bnei Noach B'Saif, that every death penalty for Noachites is by the sword, decapitating. Ella, unless in Baal Eishes Yisrael, if the Noachide committed adultery by having relations with a Jewish married woman, or a betrothed girl between the age of 12 and 12 and a half. Okay, that is a very, very specific law that is dealt with in the Bible. It speaks about this Na'ara Me'oirasa. Na'ara is a very specific age between 12 and 6 months, that half a year. And Me'oirasa means that she went through stage 1 of marriage, which basically means that she was given, as today would be a ring, or she was given something, anything of value for the sake of marriage. But they did not yet consummate the marriage. So she's considered a married woman. So in the case of a girl of that age and of that stage of marriage, so the penalty then is skila, stoning to death. And here too, these two cases are an exception. And instead of the Noachide getting beheaded, he would get the more severe punishment of being stoned for any one of these two sins. And then another technical stage. What happens if the Noachide had relations with this Jewish girl not only after she became betrothed by giving her a ring for the sake of marriage, but she already came into the chuppah, the canopy, but her husband did not yet consummate the marriage. They didn't have actual marital relations. There was no intercourse yet. So if at that point the Noachite had relations with her, Yechonek, he is then strangled to death. So those are the exceptions. So as a rule, the type of death penalty is number 3, is decapitating. But in these two cases, or we have skila, stoning to death, which is the most severe, and the Noachite could get it in these cases, or strangulation, which is the lesser, even lesser than decapitating. Any questions? Remember, this is not practical nowadays in any event, but it's important to know the law, what the Torah does say about it. No questions, we could go further. All right. We're going to continue. Law number 6. Mipia Kabbalah. We have an oral tradition. Remember, in the Torah, the Bible, the written law, the 5 books of Moses, is just the written law. And then we have what's much, much greater, surely in quantity by far, many, many times, is the oral law, otherwise known as the Talmud, which part of it is explanations of the written law. The 613 commandments, and for that matter, the 7 Noachite commandments, are all found in the written law, but none of them can be fully and properly understood without the oral tradition. But then you have, within the oral law itself, many laws and details that are not even found in the written law, but they're completely oral tradition. That many of them go back to Mount Sinai, that God did tell it to Moses. But it's not like, oh, he told him, write this verse or write these verses, and here's what it means. It's not at all mentioned or hinted to in the written law. It's completely given over as oral tradition from generation to generation until finally it was written down over 1,000 years after the giving of the law at Sinai, because people were forgetting and too many disputes were coming along and misunderstandings. So it then was written down. So we have the following oral tradition that goes back to Moses receiving it at Sinai. Bnei Noach, that Noachites, Asurin are forbidden beharboas behema. In, it's not called grafting by animals, in crossbreeding animals. Even though it seems like that's a commandment for Jews, it's not one of the 7 mitzvahs Bnei Noach. How do we get this? Yet, it is an oral tradition that it applies to Noachites as well. So it is not only for the Jew a prohibition, but it is forbidden, and it's not one of the 7. It's still forbidden for the Noachites to crossbreed animals. Uvaharboas ilon bilvad, and to graft, I guess would be the term, of trees, but only trees. other mixtures, different plants and different seeds and things like that would be permitted. It's just they cannot do it to trees. They nerogin alehen, but they are not put to death for either of these two prohibitions. It's not one of the seven. Therefore, the penalty is not death, as usually we said is the case for any transgression. Here, they're forbidden to do these two things, but there's no death penalty. And now, another interesting thing. It says like this: the goy shika Yisrael, a non-Jew, a Noachide, that struck a Jew, afilu chaval by kolshehu, even if he actually wounded him. Afal pishu chayav misa, even though the Noachide who hit a Jew, that is a capital offense. Eino nerag, he's not killed. Very interesting. Not just nowadays when we can't. Even when we had the ability, and even when there was a court system in place, and even at the time when anybody who transgressed any of the seven was really put to death, as long as there was a witness and proper judge, etc. For this sin, for a Noachide hitting a Jew, even though it's a capital offense, he wouldn't be put to death. So it's interesting that you find a concept of someone doing something which is so severe that it's considered a capital offense, and yet we don't actually put them to death. Now, according to some of the commentaries on Maimonides, what it means then to say that it's a capital offense. So what do you mean you don't put them to death? How does that work? Because then what comes in is a concept which we find for the Jew in the Torah, and that is something called Misa, death, Bidei Shamayim, in the hands of heaven. There are a number of sins for the Jew that the penalty for it is not one of the 4 death penalties of the Jewish court, but instead the heavenly court would put the person to death. Meaning that the person would die prematurely because they committed that sin, which that too doesn't apply nowadays. Just like there's no such thing as a court being able to kill anyone today, so too a person who transgresses, a Jew who transgresses something which would be a death penalty by the heavenly court does not die prematurely. So in this case, when we say that the Noachide has transgressed a capital offense, but they're not put to death, according to some, what that means is that the heavenly court would put the person to death. And that Noachide would somehow die prematurely. But no court would have the right to do that. And for the Jew, and I would assume that it's the same for the Noachite, although I can't say with certainty, the heavenly court only judges a person once they reach age 20. Normally we say an adult is a boy is 13, a girl is 12, and that's it. And age 18 or 21, all those things play no role. You are a complete, mature, intelligent, responsible adult by Jewish law if you're a boy of 13 years of age and a girl of 12 years of age. I mean, actually, if you want to get really technical, so on a biblical level, they have to also be physically mature. They have to have minimal pubic signs that they have matured. It's not just the age. But otherwise, that's all it takes. Except for the laws of when a person would be punished by the heavenly court. For that, the person has to be age 20. So I would assume that the same thing applies to Noachite. If there's a concept that we're saying now of being punished by the heavenly court, so I would assume that it's also 20. Any questions or comments?
Rabbi, I have a question, and it had to do with that question about the sterilization of the animals.
Yeah.
Would that be the violation?
I'm sorry. You said the sterilization of the animals?
Right, and
we didn't mention that tonight.
well, what I mean was the crossbreeding.
Yes.
So even though because you said it had nothing, there was no punishment. Well, I read what you read, so there's no punishment for the Gentile, but the prohibition is because when you crossbreed an animal, like I used the example of the horse and the mule, and you make a burrow become sterile, so that prevents that and those animals from reproducing.
That's just in that case. Are there any crossbreeds that could reproduce?
I don't know. I
I would
mean,
assume so.
that's example. I know for sure that when you crossbreed those two animals, the burrow is sterile, so it cannot reproduce.
Right. I think that's unique to them. Is the definition of a mule the crossbreed between a horse and a donkey?
Right. So, oh, I guess a burrow is a mule, but well, yeah, donkey and a horse. That's what I meant. So you
Right.
get the burrow. But now
That's the only
dogs,
animal that
I know that you crossbreed dogs, you're going to get a dog, and they can probably reproduce. But
Right.
so I guess it depends on the animal. But the one specifically I do know about is the horse and the donkey. When you breed them,
I think those are the only animals that I'm aware of that when you come up with this new product known as a mule, which is even mentioned in the Bible already, that it cannot reproduce. But that's unique. And yet we're saying that the prohibition of crossbreeding applies to any animal, even if the new product can.
you know what? I think there was something on a animal program that I was watching that they was crossbreeding. They was breeding tigers and lions, and it was becoming, I can't remember what they even called it, but I think there was a similar situation with those animals that crossbreeding them, once it became that kind of an animal, it could not reproduce the same.
Yeah, but again, I don't think that it's limited to the animals that cannot reproduce. Across the board, it is forbidden to crossbreed.
Right.
Now, I would think maybe, big maybe, perhaps the problem is, and I'm very reluctant in what I'm about to say, perhaps the problem is that it's like meddling and like tampering with the natural created world of God. And he created so many and so many species and so many animals that who gives us the right to, mix and crossbreed.
Yeah, so there's got to be a definite reason that's why he did that, to make it so, he made it so serious to know that you can do it, because it does, even if you breed different kinds of dogs, one, they were created for a specific purpose. So once you combine the two with two different purposes and you put them together, well, like a rat terrier like I'm just gonna use a pit bull or something. I mean, that's two different extremes of an animal that you can't even imagine what kind of how it's going to act, and so it's basically that's basically what you did is you kind of yeah, actually basically what you just said is true. So we've meddled in something that shouldn't have been, and we made something new. Or
Yeah, but I have a problem with that, but that's just, what do you want to say, Bob?
I think with in the case of dogs, the various domestic dogs breeds
Are all one type.
are all one species. So even though you have a wide variety, and that might cause problems if you mix them, halachically they're considered one species, so they would be permitted to be cross done. But there's certain wild animals that are part of the dog.
Like a wolf
thing
or a
that-
fox.
Yeah, certain of those are considered different species.
right,
I'm not sure
really,
which one.
I don't think you ever see those much mingling together to procreate, but I guess maybe a dog in the wild would, but I mean, I haven't seen any documentaries of where you see something like that happen. I guess it could.
There's a
But-
lot of wolf dog breeds. They call them, I think, half wolves or whatever. There's a lot of wolf and dog breeds.
Is that something that they would do while they're in captivity and are tame and because that's what happened with the
Not
tigers and the
necessarily.
lions, is they got them tame and in captivity. And that's how they reproduce, because they combine together and
Typically breeders will do it. They'll say that that whatever dog is half wolf hybrid dogs.
Right. So basically what we're just trying to find is that Hashem made it so serious that he said, look, you can't do this because you're gonna go against something that I created to be a specific way, and now it's gonna be different.
Yeah, but I'm not so sure.
Anyways, he made it serious enough that he put it in there, said, do not do this. It's a big violation, so.
Right, but then we say about trees that, for example, for Jews, there's a whole prohibition of mixing vines of grapes with grain. You have to have a distance. You can't have wheat growing side by side together with grapes. For a Ben Noach, there's no problem doing that. So it's clearly there's a difference. But for some reason, for Noachide, the two things which are forbidden are animals and trees, but not all of plants. Or another mixture, which is definitely permitted for the Noachites, and that is to mix wool and linen in the same garment. Does that say over there? I missed it. Okay. I think Veronica sent us all a message or something. Wasn't sure. So for a Jew, it's forbidden to wear a garment that has wool and linen woven together in the same garment. And for Noachites, there's no problem. So it's not that every forbidden mixture is forbidden across the board. For some reason, these two are forbidden for Noachites as well.
Wool, is it just wool and linen?
For a Jew, yeah,
Yeah.
wool and linen are forbidden to be woven in the same garment.
So that's just those two fabrics. So it could be
Anything else is fine.
Okay.
And you could even wear wool and linen at the same time, as long as it's two separate garments. Like, whatever, a wool jacket and, linen pants or whatever. But in the same garment, they can't be together.
So I imagine that there's stores that Jews have that. They primarily know that, so that's already going to be.
Well, they do. There actually is a laboratory that checks for it. And when a Jew buys clothing, they're supposed to give their garments to be examined. And then they get a tag inside the garment that says non-shatnez or shatnez free. Shatnez is the biblical term for this particular type of mixture. Yeah. But that doesn't apply to Noachites.
Are you on Facebook or YouTube? I'm trying to find you, but I can't find you.
What are you looking for?
You. I'm looking for you. I mean, I know you're here, but I just seen you recently putting things on YouTube, but what's your first name, Rabbi? Maybe that's what I'm missing.
L-I.
Are you on Facebook?
No, not that I know of.
Okay.
I'm actually computer illiterate.
Show him your kosher phone.
I'm technologically illiterate. This is much too advanced for me. This flip phone.
Yeah,
I barely know how to use this.
that's historic. But you got video because I've been seeing you on. So you're putting things on YouTube.
Well, my
This is
My tech
this
man.
is on YouTube right now.
right now we're live on YouTube.
Okay, so how do I get there? So it's Rabbi.
Or I think Chicago,
Chicago Bnei Noach.
Bnei Noach.
Oh. Okay.
Hey, Rabbi, I have a kind of a off-subject question.
Go ahead.
What is kosher butter? Or what makes butter kosher? I just saw some and I bought some and I was just wondering.
Well, it's actually a better question than I think you mean. And let me tell you, let me explain. For dairy products to be kosher, they must come from a kosher animal. A cow, a goat, any kosher female animal that produces milk, that's kosher. And then the various different products that are made, whatever types of cheese would be made from it, as well as kosher. I'm not going to get into the whole thing of the rennet, of how that works, but otherwise, any dairy product, for it to be kosher, must be 100% from a kosher animal, such as a cow, goat, sheep, whatever it may be. Now, butter, which is also dairy, can only be made, not legally, halachically, physically, if I'm not mistaken, to make butter, for some reason, you can only make it from kosher milk. Try using camel milk or horse milk. For some reason, you can't get butter, or you can clearly see the difference as opposed to cheese. So for that reason, butter, according to many, is a different category and may not need to be as careful about it to make sure that it's kosher, because it's automatically kosher according to many authorities. Did I answer the question?
Kind of, yeah, I guess. I don't know why they would have said that right on the package that it was kosher.
Well, any dairy product has to say that it's kosher. And then you get into a whole discussion, and that is called Chalav Yisrael. That milk or a product, a dairy product that was either milked or supervised by a Jew, which that's a rabbinic requirement. But otherwise, Like a lot of the dairy things will just say on it kosher, and they'll have the kosher symbol, whether it's the U in a circle or the K or whatever, any other dozen or so kosher supervisions. But some of them will actually say on them that it's chalav, which means milk, Yisroel, which means Jew.
Okay, thanks. I was just.
Rabbi Turin,
Yes.
sorry. My question was something someone was asking on Ask Noah tonight. And I'm, it's about the modesty issue. And they were asking about head coverings for women and men who are Noahides. Is that something that we can do? Like say a Muslim asked his mother-in-law to wear a head covering at his wedding. And as a Noahide, they were wondering if that was something that we could do.
So with your patience and permission, allow me to twist your question, okay? I'm going to ask it a little bit differently than I understood what you just said. I'm going to actually come from a completely different angle. Is a married Noahide woman obligated to cover her hair? A Jewish married woman is obligated. It is a must that she cover her hair in public for sure. A Jewish married woman. Historically speaking, it seems like 3,000-4,000 years ago, etc., that was the common practice by everyone. All nations, even all religions at the time, it seems like everybody covered their hair. Every married woman covered her hair. So the question is, does a Noahide woman today who's married need to cover her hair? And I don't recall for sure, but I'm assuming that in the Divine Code, they speak about it, at least in the Hebrew one. And my understanding is that they definitely should. Not saying that it's as mandatory as a Jewish woman, but definitely a married Noahide woman as a means of modesty should cover her hair. Okay, that's A. Men covering their hair is a completely different subject, not to be confused. When Jewish men cover their head, that is very different than Jewish women. Jewish women that are married, as I said, they must cover their hair. Jewish men, it's a custom which developed over the years, and it's not the same, it's not as important as for the woman, for the married woman. So, what you said about someone asking, a Muslim asking his mother-in-law to cover her hair, so that in itself, I think that's great. She shouldn't even have to be asked. The question which I think you're talking about is doing it in a way or for the sake of Islam, like their religion. Am I correct?
Yeah, for the sake of their religion. I'm sorry, my connectivity keeps dropping in and out, so I have to kind of catch you as I can. Yeah, that's what the question was about. It's the Muslim asking his mother-in-law to honor the Muslim tradition of this particular act.
Does he want her to cover her hair in a particular way, or as long as she covers it?
I think as long as she covers it is the way the question was framed.
Then on the contrary, I think it's a wonderful thing. And she doesn't have to feel that she's doing it because of the Islam religion. She's doing it because she's a Noahide. And it's proper for married women to have their hair covered. And that's besides the fact that of all religions, Islam is not exactly idolatry, even though they obviously have wrong stuff and their prophet and all that is off, but they are worshiping the one and only Hashem, God Almighty. But I don't think there's a problem with her covering her hair, unless it's in a very specific way that is done by Muslims. So then that would be a different discussion.
I'm sorry, I have to catch that on the replay. My video, my audio kept going out.
Sorry.
That's okay. I'll watch it on the replay.
Okay,
Can I ask a question?
sure.
By what sage is a Gentile required? Who says that a Gentile that is married is required to cover her hair? By what authority?
Okay, good question.
I know the Divine
So-
Code recommends.
I'm sorry?
I know the Divine Code recommends it,
Yeah,
but not by the Divine Code. I'm asking by the sages.
okay. So the question really is, you can ask it even sort of say of a more basic question. What's the source that a Jewish married woman has to cover her hair? It's not one of the 613 commandments. How does that come into the picture? So, biblically speaking, the source for it is from in the book of Numbers, somewhere around chapter 5, 6, or 7 or something. It's in the second Torah portion of the book of Numbers, where there's a very lengthy section about what's called in the biblical language the woman that's a soita, S-O-T-A-H, soita. That's a very complicated case where basically a married woman is suspected by her husband to have been promiscuous with someone else. We don't know that she committed adultery. There are no two witnesses that witnessed an actual sin. And it's a lot of details. The end is that he is to bring his wife to the Holy Temple, to the Beis HaMikdash. And part of the process, the embarrassing process, is that they uncover her hair. And that's considered like big shame. Like, wow. So based on that, there's the whole Talmudic discussion about a married woman's hair. And therefore, the Talmud rules, and this is the ruling in the Jewish Code of Law, that the hair of a married Jewish woman, at least, is considered erva, which means private, which means that a man who's not her husband would be forbidden to look at, or for that matter, to pray or say holy words in the presence of that woman. So now the question is, how does that apply to a Noachide? So if you're going to say that it's because logically it's a certain type of attraction or personal, private part of the woman, then it should apply to any woman that has that status of being married. See, although the laws of dress and modesty are not as clear cut, that developed over the years. like exactly to the centimeter, which part of a woman's body needs to be covered is not very clear cut in that sense. I mean, today, Jewish tradition in the Jewish code of law does have the minimum requirements. But that's not like the issue of a married woman's hair. So therefore, I would say that for a Noachite woman, she need not necessarily be as clearly modest in her dress, aside from the hair, as a Jewish woman or Jewish girl. But then the question is, okay, so where do you draw the line? For example, the Jewish code of law demands of a girl, surely from age 12 and up, really from younger, but let's just keep it simple, from age 12 and up. From age 12 and up, that her sleeves go past her elbow. Okay? And if the common practice at the time and at the location is to actually have it further down, then she has to have it further down. But no matter what, she can't have it higher than the elbow. I wouldn't say that that's the same for a Noachite. A 12-year-old non-Jewish girl who needs to be modest, I don't think that she has to have her elbow covered at all times. But then the question is, okay, so where do you draw the line? Can she go sleeveless? Say, well, no, that's not modest. Why not? Is it acceptable? Is it not? So there's more room to play around with what's the common practice amongst modest people. So therefore, that could change from location to location or from time to time. But when it comes to the hair, that's a different category, because that's unequivocally. We don't say that a 95-year-old woman who her hair is not that attractive, that then it's okay. No. If she's a married woman, her hair must be covered. Even though she looks more attractive and she looks younger with this nice wig that she's wearing. Doesn't matter. She can't have her own natural hair exposed. So it's not a matter of trying to make her look unattractive or ugly. That's not, by any means, that's not it. Some of the wigs that very religious Jewish women wear are very attractive or very beautiful. That's not the problem. It's a matter of private, intimate part of her that we see that the Bible considers her hair to be in that category. So again, the question is, do we really apply that to the Noachites or not? So it would be advisable, it would be commendable, if that's indeed what the divine code says. But I don't know if it's absolutely mandatory as it is by a Jewish woman.
So bear with me really quickly. So if you're having my thought process is that Jewish women and non-Jewish women in ancient times covered their hair, because you're referencing the information in Numbers, where, uncovering a woman's hair was a symbol of shame, or it was shameful. Didn't even younger girls in those ancient times cover their hair? Whereas today, if it's a matter of privacy or it being private and only for her husband to see, I would question that, only because if a 20-year-old Jewish woman is looking for her shidduch, she does not have to have her hair covered. It's recommended to braid it back. It's recommended to not have it maybe flowing everywhere, but she's not required to cover it, because she would not be able to find a proper suitor, because they would assume that she was married. So to me, the connection in this day is just symbolic of marriage. Whereas with the Gentile today, we use rings to symbolize this. I know with a Jewish woman, there's also a mystical connection, where they say that there's some sort of, mystical power in the hair. So I don't think that's the case for a non-Jewish woman. So those are my thoughts.
Okay, very good. So a number of things here. Let me start with the latter. Many things in Jewish law, probably everything, has the exoteric and the esoteric. And there is the Kabbalistic, deeper spiritual reasons for every law. And when that doesn't apply, it doesn't change the law. So even though you may be right, and the hair of a married Jewish woman may have this certain type of intense spiritual power that needs to be covered and concealed. And following that reasoning and that logic, it only applies to a Jewish married woman. That's if you're viewing it purely on the esoteric, Kabbalistic, secret, spiritual plane. But looking at it from the plain exoteric reason, even if it's somewhat psychological, so then it would apply to a Noachite as well, even though the esoteric part doesn't apply. So let's say that, see, it's very hard for us to relate to it today because we're living in the Western civilization where it's so normal for women not to cover their hair. So it's very hard for us to put ourselves back in time 1,000 or 2,000-3,000 years ago and try to envision what it's like, because we've come, so far from that. But really, the hair of a married woman is very personal, very private for some reason. So then that could apply to men, to Jew and non-Jew alike, possibly. That's one thing. And another point that you made was that they used to go like this from a very young age. I would suggest that's because they were married at a young age. Whoever heard of a girl not being married by age 13? She's an old maid by age 13. In ancient times, we've got, in all nationalities and cultures, I'm assuming most everybody was married by that very young age. So it's like hard to differentiate and say, well, they were covering their hair from a very young age. What other point did you make? That it's symbolic, or for shidduchim. It's not really that in order to find a shidduch, to get her, to find her mate, to be able to find someone, that's why she's not required to cover her hair. It's not just a symbol like a ring. It's actually, forbidden. And that's why, according to most authorities, if she's no longer married, she's widowed or divorced, she still needs to continue covering her hair. Even though she'd like to remarry. She still has to have whatever hair covering she's, whether it's a wig or a kerchief or hat, whatever she's wearing, depending on the custom. Let me just share with you a midrash, a story from the oral tradition. There's an episode that happens in the Bible, in the book of Numbers, known as the story of Korach, Korach. You may remember it from studying it in the Bible. He had 250 men with him and rebelled against Moses and Aaron. It was a tragic story. So right at the beginning, when it introduces the players of this episode in the Torah, it says Korach took, and along with him, he had from the tribe of Reuben. Korach was a Levite, but he took with him most of the people from the tribe of Reuben, the oldest of the 12 tribes. And it names 3 people: Dasan and Aviram and Oin, the son of Peles. Oin. Okay. At the end, Oin's name is not mentioned anymore in the story. He somehow is not there in the whole episode, even though initially he's there in the first verse. So what happened? This is not written in the written Bible. So the Midrash tells us that when his wife, this is actually a source how a good wife can save her husband. And even if he's not so good, but the wife can actually be the savior. And then there's also goes the other way around, that you can have that the wife is the one who destroys a man. But this part is the one how the wife saves her husband. What happened was as follows. She saw what's going on. She saw that her husband was joining this party, and she wanted to save him. She couldn't speak to him logically. That wouldn't work. He was convinced he was joining the opposing party. So when he came home, she had him drink a lot of wine, and he fell into a deep sleep. When they came to fetch him to join, when it was time for the duel, for the confrontation, he's missing. He's one of the key players. He's not there. So they came to get him. He was in the tent sleeping. His wife had complete self-sacrifice to save her husband's life. And what she did was she came outside, she sat right in front of their tent, and she uncovered her head, completely uncovered her hair. And then these people, the rebels, couldn't come close. They couldn't approach the tent because she's sitting there with her hair uncovered, and they're not going to dare look at a married woman with her hair uncovered. So nobody approached. Out of all of the clan of Korach's people that were rebelling against Moses and Aaron, no one came close. And he slept through the whole episode of how there was, at the end, the earth opened up and swallowed them up, and they all perished. All of the people of Korach, all his 250 people, along with all of their families. It was a very tragic story. He didn't. He was saved. So it's so incredible here that because she uncovered her hair, nobody dared. Nobody said, well, who cares? Big deal. I'm just going to go anyway. I have to go get him. No, that was enough at that time to scare away, to keep away anyone. Sort of as proof as to how important it must be, is that it seems, even for Jewish women, such a difficult thing to do. For some reason, they feel that it's such a challenge, or they just find it hard to cover their hair. And it's like, I mean, I wouldn't know. how could I don't know what they're really feeling, but as a man, you wonder, like, what's the big deal? What do you care? Get a nice wig. And somehow they feel like, many of them, not everyone, they feel that it's just, they're ready to dress modestly. They'll dress with modest clothing, not too short, not too tight, not exposing, and the colors are all modest. Everything's fine. But some of them have difficulty with the concept of covering their hair. I guess that just shows how important it is, and that really is something which is very deeply, strongly connected to the woman herself.
Wouldn't it also might be the law of attraction? Like, it's okay when you're pursuing someone for your shidduch, but after you become married, like the Torah talks about, that a woman shouldn't wear too much makeup and too much jewelry because you're going to draw attraction to yourself. Isn't that the same concept? Because, I'm just speaking from a man's point of view, because I do like long hair, that when I see a woman with her hair long and flowing versus when even if it's not covered, but if it's tied up in a bun, there's a difference in attraction to me.
That's why she mentioned that it should really be either braided or somehow just not flowing all over the place. Right. But here we're talking about whether it's covered or not.
Okay, I'm going to jump in with my 2 cents.
Yeah.
As a Noahide, I mean, I'm not married, so, I'm free. But I don't necessarily agree that we should recommend that Noahide women cover their hair, mostly because we are part of the nations. We do have to, we don't want to necessarily look separate, I guess. And that's just kind of my opinion. I think that, yes, we should be modest to a degree, but not so that we look like a totally separate species, like Islam women, where they're covered with a burqa.
What type of hair covering are you talking about?
Any kind of hair covering. I mean, sure, we're going to wear wigs if that's maybe a cultural thing, like, I know Black women tend to wear a lot, wigs. I think if I had chemo and I lost all my hair, I'd probably wear a wig, but not necessarily as a modesty thing. And not necessarily the scarves that that a lot of the Jewish women wear. I don't know. I just, we're not Jewish, and I don't think that we should necessarily look Jewish, or we should look like we belong to a Muslim group, or or a headscarf, or anything that makes us look like not of the nations, not of our culture, like an American culture, and or whatever.
Right, but you yourself said that a wig could be worn for various other reasons.
Absolutely. I just don't think that we should necessarily teach as a Noahide group for our married women to wear something on their head, because we're not part of the Jewish culture, I guess, in a sense.
Right. The question is it something which is required, or at least advisable for the Noachites? That's really the discussion.
I don't think it is. Personally, I don't think it is.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in on that and explain that in ancient times, everyone dressed similarly. Whereas today, we would look as though we are trying to imitate Jewish women or Muslim women. And while we're sitting there, you know, just as when non-Jewish men opt to wear kippahs and talits and all those kinds of things in public, you know, while they're eating their shrimp, their lobster, and all the other things they're not obligated to not eat. While we're doing certain activities, there's only so many ways to wear a hat. I mean, if we're wearing a baseball cap, that doesn't look out of place. But what are you wearing a baseball cap inside the house? What are you wearing a baseball cap when it's hot outside, or excuse me, when it's not hot outside? There's a lot of reasons it would look impractical to wear your hair covered in as a part of the nations. It just would look, I think, like we are a part of some sort of a cult. So,
What about a wig? Go ahead. Bob wants to say something.
I'm just gonna say, if we're viewing it as covering the hair for the sake of covering the hair out of you know, some kind of a spiritual need or a halakhic need, is it like the shotness where it doesn't apply, or is it something like modesty where it would apply? That's sort of where we have to differentiate. And is the hair covering an issue of modesty within our society? Maybe it is. I mean, I know a lot of you know, there are subcultures within our society that where they do cover their head, where they do cover their hair in certain churches and that's considered modesty. Other places it would not be. So I guess you'd have to look at what within the person's quote, you know, within their social group, what makes sense. But if there's a need for us to wear, you know, for women to wear hair coverings out of a halakhic issue, then is it like shotness? Yeah, I don't know.
Let me just remind everyone, let's refer back to what we learned a little bit ago. In chapter 9, here in Maimonides, in law 8, about owning if a Noachite owns a slave and a maidservant. So he can have them marry each other. And as long as the maidservant is married to the slave, she's considered a married woman and no one else can be with her. At what point, how does she become free again? How does she become unmarried to this slave, since it's not a regular case of marriage? So how does she become, so to say, divorced? A minute. Yeah. 5 minutes. So sorry about that. It's my son in Cincinnati. So it says, from when he separates her from his slave and will uncover her head in the public. And the main commentator on the Torah, known as Rashi, he explains that it was customary, even amongst the non-Jewish women, married women, that they would not go out in public with their hair uncovered. So therefore, to symbolize that this maid servant is no longer married to the slave, he would uncover her hair, which shows you that even if she was, well, first of all, maybe different because it wasn't a regular marriage, but at least in this case, that would be a way of publicizing that she's no longer married. So it definitely was the custom at some point back then for non-Jewish women to cover their hair when they're married.
That was like 400 years ago, but even a couple of hundred years ago, you know, there was a lot of women who in the old Wild West, you know, when they were coming across and whatever, I mean, they wore those little bonnet thingies. And that could be maybe modesty thing. I'm not sure exactly what, but for today it's a whole different thing. If I started wearing some little something or other on my hair all the time, I would definitely look out of place. And for us to be to change the world, we can't start looking like something else that we aren't. If that makes sense. I mean, I don't know. I just don't want, I don't like anything that makes us look like anything other than a non-Jew. That's just my own little thing.
I missed it. Some notes.
Kind of like a new, like a new religion, like saying, oh, okay, well, we belong to the Noahide religion, so we're going to start wearing, head scarves and kippas and talit and whatever else, but we're not. We're just not. So, sorry.
I think the underlying theme is righteousness before Hashem. We've been tossing this thing about for about 30 minutes, but it's between you and Hashem. Do you think it's going to be righteous or unrighteous before Him, according to the Torah, and we know as the concepts in this world? So I mean, that's the main point. Do we want to be righteous before Hashem and please Him, or do we want to please the world? Because that's that being set apart means is, we are not a part of the world. And, back like you said, a couple hundred years ago, it wasn't just in the West, but all throughout.
We are part of the world, Fred. We are part of the world. I mean,
right, but we have to be righteous before them.
But we are not called to be set apart. That's a Jewish obligation and not a non-Jewish obligation. We're not called to be holy.
Holy, set apart, we're not.
We are not. That's, I think you're reading that from a
we can be a part of the idolatry
lenses,
We're going to be a part of the idolatry then, because that's what they're part of.
Being a part of the nations does not automatically imply that you are a part of an idolatrous society.
Correct.
Right. Idolatry and these issues are not the same.
We are the 70 nations. We are the 70 nations. We're not Jewish. We're non-Jews. We are part of the 70 nations. And that's what they talk about, right? When they give sacrifices, when they'll give sacrifices at the temple, it's for us, the 70 for the 70 nations. So whenever we start, and I'm sorry, I keep going on about this, but whenever we start taking on customs and traditions of the Jewish people, that then we start even going further towards the Jewish people and farther away from where we belong, which is in the 70 nations.
And I think we take away their shine as well. Yeah,
I mean, it's like, okay, and Fred, I don't mean to pick on you. I'm sorry. I really do apologize. But yeah, if we even look like a Jewish person out in public, and we do go eat our lobster, which I don't, but if you do eat your lobster or your bacon or whatever, people are going to say, why is that Jewish person not eating kosher? And that's why I think that we have to be very careful when we start going into the realm of the Jewish traditions and the dress and and the customs and all that kind of stuff, because we're not, and we can make them look bad,
Oh, can you hold on for a minute?
So I'm done.
Your point is well taken. In general, I definitely agree with you that you are part of the 70 nations, and you do need to change or make them aware from within, not as an outsider. That the Jew is the one who's different and supposed to be teaching in the 70 nations. You are living by example. So the more external you fit in, the easier it is. But the flip side is, if something is a requirement, then it's a requirement. I'm not saying that in this case that is the case. But for example, let's say we're living in a time that's kind of corrupt and everybody walks around very immodest. And you say, no, that's not right. That I don't feel that I'm serving Hashem and I could be walking around like that. It looks too, whatever the expression is, what do they say, whatever, inappropriate. Okay, so then your living by example would be, no, this is how a proper Noachide is supposed to look. Anyway, I gotta go now. So till next time.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with that last thing that you said.
Okay. Thank you. Be well, everyone. Hope to see you again next week.
Bye.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, we'll be doing this, so hopefully again next week. And I'm glad we had extra people here.
Thanks, Bob. See you
Okay.
next week.
Bye-bye.
Guys.
Who knows?